Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Let's Have Renaissance, a podcast about writing, editing, publishing, literature, the arts, and more. I am Ito Utini.
And I'm Makaya Utini, and today we're speaking with Hugo dos Santos. Hugo is a Luso-American writer, poet, and translator. Born in Lisbon, Portugal, and raised in Newark, New Jersey, he investigates questions of diaspora, memory, and belonging in his fiction and poetry, while in his translations, he strives to bring the best contemporary Portuguese literature to English-speaking audiences. We're excited to be with him today.
Thank you for tuning in. We're excited that you're here. Why don't you also subscribe, like, comment, and share this episode with your friends?
And if you know anyone who wants to come on the podcast, please do send them our way. Also, if you haven't yet, sign up for our newsletter where we share updates, resources, and opportunities at thedatekeepers.com.
Hugo, thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to have you. Can you tell us about yourself?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here with you. My name is Hugo dos Santos. I am an author and a translator.
I'm excited because I am a bilingual, but I mainly think...
multilingual.
Multilingual. But I don't work in other languages besides English, but I think in other languages. How about you? Do you think in other languages sometimes? And if so, what triggers different languages in your brain?
There are some thoughts that still come to me in Portuguese, which is my first language. At this point, though, English has become the dominant language, so I would say I mainly function there. But as a translator, I translate from Portuguese into English. And so that's been a way for me to kind of continue to work in Portuguese and continue to exercise those muscles, different ways of describing the world and thinking about the world.
And how about dreams? Do you dream in English or both, or it depends?
I think I dream in English mostly. I'm one of those people, I don't remember many of my dreams. I'm a very sound sleeper.
I'm curious because I also worked as a translator for a while. What method do you use when you translate? Do you use a dictionary or do you rely on an oral traditional way of translating, like, interpreting to yourself or translating in your head and then use dictionary to verify? Can you talk about your method?
It's a great question. So Portuguese being my first language, that fluency certainly helps. And so my first draft and my early drafts are more reliant on strict translations, right? Trying to get the right word, trying to be exact and precise. And as I move beyond those initial drafts, then what I'm moving toward is finding the voice of the work in English, right? Because very seldom does the piece, once it's translated, carry the same tune that it did in the original. And then as I go on, I take a little more liberty to make sure that it's not just a strict word-for-word translation that's just literal and doesn't carry the same literary value. And I try to then in those late drafts make sure that the piece really works either as a poem or as a story.
And for listeners who might not be familiar with multilingualism or translation, can you talk about why literal translation is not always optimal and what philosophy of translation you have? Like, what makes a good translation as opposed to a literal word-for-word translation?
For me, in trying to translate a piece of literature, you want it to work as a piece of literature once it's translated. And so a lot of the work that goes into it is not just, again, capturing exactly what was being conveyed in the original, but really playing with the genre that you're in. If it's poem, if it's short fiction, if it's long fiction, to make sure that rather than capturing the words in the same sequence, which doesn't always work going from one language to the other, that instead you end up, for instance, with a sentence or with a phrase that can convey the same meaning and can bring about, if not the same effect, a similar effect, so that the person reading, in this case in English, in the translated language, is able to enjoy it as a piece of art and hopefully not sit there thinking like, oh, this is a piece that was translated and I can kind of see the mechanics of how it was done. That's for me what a lot of those later drafts become. It's really a way to hide or make more prominent the art of it rather than the literal meaning of it, because that's not always the most important thing.
And if you know that your work is going to be translated into another language, a language that you don't speak or read or write, and you have the opportunity to speak with the translator, what would you want to say to the translator to make sure that justice is done to your work in the destination language that you don't yourself speak? What are the principles that you would like to convey to that translator and the values so that you know that your work will stand up in that other language?
Yeah, I think if you're entering into a partnership with, in this case, a translator or anybody else in your art, that relationship needs to be based on trust, right? And mutual respect. And so I think striking a balance between my ideas that I'm bringing into the project and allowing them room to do the thing that they're good at. And I think when you find ways of doing that, everybody's happy. It's always for a better outcome. And when I've worked as a translator, I've been fortunate enough to work with authors who are living and authors that I had access to. And that ability to connect and trade ideas has been invaluable. And, the work I've translated, my translation would simply not be as good without that access. And so that's the way I like to kind of come together through this work of art and bring something that for me as a translator, I found great meaning in its original language and trying to replicate or create some of that magic in a different language.
In translation, we come across idioms or things that you read and you're like, oh my God, this is not going to make sense to American readers or vice versa. How do you navigate that? Do you explain it? Because a lot of people think translation is copy and paste, but sometimes you have to insert yourself as a translator to be
Absolutely.
like a
Yeah.
bridge builder.
That's right. That's right. It really is about that bridge you're building. And I mean, this is a question that might be easier to answer with concrete examples. So one example I know is from a book I translated in 2016, A Child in Ruins. And I was working with the author, José Luís Peixoto, who is a Portuguese author. And he had this beautiful poem about kind of the end of an evening, of a night after hosting a dinner party and washing the dishes and cleaning the kitchen. And he has this one line in Portuguese in the poem that talks about stacking the forks neatly in the drawer. And I can't recall exactly how it was written in Portuguese, but I remember just struggling over that line so much. And then what I came up with, it was one of those things, sometimes this happens in translation also, is you kind of have to create some distance from it, which is, I guess, not that different from when you're writing your own piece. Sometimes you're just kind of banging your head against a problem, something you need to solve, either it's plot related or something else. And the solution can only come when you give yourself some space. And so I took a little bit of that from the poem, and then I came back to it and it was so clear. I was like, oh, I know exactly what to do. And I came up with this line that I think made it to the book, which was the forks spooning together. Which is a turn of phrase that just doesn't exist in Portuguese, this idea of spooning, right?
But it
But I
works.
really liked the image, and I thought it brought a different kind of life to these inanimate objects. And so in one of the rounds, I reached out to José Luís and I asked him, hey, look, full disclosure, I don't know how I feel about this, but can you give me a gut check? And he, of course, was just so surprised, no, I really like it. This is great. Let's go with it. And so that is, I think, an example that in some ways covers a number of the questions we've been talking about in terms of the relationship you're able to build, how that relationship really becomes a partnership when you can do it right. And so, again, I don't know what I would have done with that line if not for that.
Also, cultures evolve. And if you're translating something that was written 10 years ago to make it make sense now in a different culture and language, you have to update that too.
And that's to say nothing, especially when you're working with poetry, of form, right? Or rhyme and alliteration and the way the words play with and off of one another. So you have so many jobs as a translator. And so that to me is really the challenge and the fun aspect of being a literary translator, is that when you can do it, you've really been able to recreate a piece of magic in a way that didn't exist before, by taking something that was only accessible to some people and broadening the audience. And so that's something that really excites me about that work.
And how do you choose works to translate?
Works that I'm drawn to, authors that I'm drawn to. That's kind of how I got my start in that world, pursuing those opportunities. And then in doing that, there were other benefits that I could not have foreseen, right? I learned so much about craft by having to dig deeply and to really study these poems or study short fiction or longer pieces and then have to solve for how to create that literary translation. I learned so much about writing. That was really it. And it's been a long road, but it's one that I find myself continuing to come back to because it feels really important to create space for other voices, for other ways of seeing the world and experiencing the world, and making sure that an English-speaking audience has access to that.
And have you worked as an interpreter? If so, which do you prefer? Translation or interpretation?
At this point, translation. I grew up interpreting for my parents. I was 10 when we came to the US, and so there was quite a bit of that. But these days, I find myself doing less of that, obviously, and just in addition to my own writing, really enjoying the process of translation.
Do you have a favorite work that you've read in translation?
Yeah, there's a poem by the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa, and I believe it's a Richard Zenith translation. The poem is titled Autopsychography, and the first line is, "The poet is a faker." It's one of those rare instances where, Richard Zenith is just a fantastic translator, but it's one of those rare moments where the translator was just able to capture, in this case in English, so much of the magic of the original that it almost feels like you're not really missing anything if you can only read it in English. And those moments are so rare. And as a translator, knowing those struggles firsthand, that's a translation I really admire.
And when you write, do you have a way of dividing yourself into a writer and translator? Do you think as a writer or a translator when you're writing your work specifically?
So I recently, just earlier this month, I had the experience of doing a reading with some folks out in California, and I was reading from my new collection. And, I'm only now starting to read publicly many of those poems, right? So there was that, which made the day really special. But another aspect of that event that made the day really special for me is there was a translator who specializes in going the other way, in translating from English to Portuguese. And so she had translated, some of those poems, which again are still so fresh for me. And she had translated them into Portuguese. And, we were trading messages before the event, and I told her, I want to see them actually before the event. I might be a total mess, right? As I hear you reading these in Portuguese, but let's just do it for the experience. And it was just an amazing moment because it was recorded. So I was able to share it with my mother, with my sister, with some of the family I still have back in Portugal, folks who typically can't readily access the work that I'm publishing. And so to have an event like that with the translator who showed that much care and generosity, was able to translate them into Portuguese, and then to hear those words that I had written in one language captured in what was, again, my first tongue, was just such a magical moment. So
That's really cool.
that one definitely stands out.
Would you ever translate your own work, or do you have a policy against that? And if so, why?
I try not to deal in absolutes. Life is long and full of surprises, but I haven't. I'll say that just because in thinking of the work that I'm producing in English, I feel way more comfortable translating from Portuguese into English than I do the other way. And so I think that for me has been a kind of barrier that I haven't wanted to test myself with yet. So who knows, someday. But yeah, it's definitely not something I've stipulated for myself. It just hasn't happened.
And why poetry? Why do you write poetry?
Poetry was really my first love. I remember, 11, 12, jotting down lines and poems. And then in high school, it was something that I was doing all the time, especially in the evening. I found myself going to bed, winding down. I used to keep a legal pad next to my bed, and I would just jot them down. And then at some point, I would share with people, or we'd listen to a song, and I would say, I wrote something that reminds me of this. And then I would share it. And it wasn't until I saw people reacting to it that I was like, oh, maybe there is something here. Some of us who end up in this field just know from very early on that we want to be writers, right? I hear so many stories of writers. I wrote my first book at 6. And that's always so heartwarming. For me, that wasn't the experience. I didn't start to see myself in this way until I saw people reacting to it. And then as I started to think about that and process that, and then certainly once I got into college and I really developed a finer love for reading and for stories, that's when it really picked up for me. And I started thinking, no, this is my thing.
Can you talk about your publishing journey and what are you doing to promote your book?
I was just talking about this last week. I visited a friend's classroom. It's a college class on publishing, and I was talking about this kind of the two worlds you have to straddle as an author. One is the writing world, and another one's the publishing world, and how different they are and how they have different demands on you, regardless of the trajectory that you're going with, whether you're self-publishing or going through an independent press or going through one of the big houses. And so for me, it all begins with similar to how I was talking about translation, me just really focusing on nothing but capturing the poem, the story, whatever it is, and really making sure that that's my North Star, right? Capturing this little piece of magic that's brought me to the page and kind of forgetting about anything else that might happen later. And so on the writing side, that is what I found to work. Figuring out where this goes, where it belongs, where it will find a home, that's for later. Right now, I'm just worried about, can I do this? Because there are times I can't, right? There are times I set out to write a poem and my mind seems beautiful and perfect and it comes out like anything but. And there are other times where I am able to capture what I was out to capture, and those moments are magical. So on the writing side, that's really it for me. Just making sure I'm disciplined enough to create the space and create the time that I need to do right by that piece. On the publishing, and it's a very different exercise. It's one of promotion and persistence and being the biggest believer in what it is that you're trying to put out into the world, because no one's going to believe in it more than you. And if you don't believe in it, it's going to be very difficult to get people to pay attention. There's just so many distractors in publishing and other mediums, right? And so I think that's the challenge. That's something I'm thinking about a lot now as I'm bringing this book out. And so really thinking through the lens of the poetry game, which is also different from, for instance, fiction and nonfiction and those markets and how you would approach them.
Do you think there's a parallel between translation and marketing? And I ask because, we all know most writers hate marketing their own work and just hate marketing, period. And one of the things that we try to do is reframe marketing in language that makes sense to writers. So when we're talking to other fiction writers or narrative nonfiction writers, we talk about how marketing is just telling a story about your story. And it seems to me there might be some parallels with translation too. Have you thought about that? And if so, what do you think those parallels are?
I think that's a great observation. I think there are some parallels for sure. Marketing for me when I was younger felt yucky. It felt performative. It felt more comfortable for me, for instance, to be campaigning for the book of a friend, right? Or a poem that I had come across in a magazine that just blew me away than my own work. I just felt so self-conscious about that. I felt like, am I just trying to market this? Am I taking this thing that was pure to begin with and trying to capitalize on it? And my thinking on that has evolved. Now I very much think of it kind of like you just described. You need to get out there. You need to tell people what it's about. And then if they're not interested, that's fine. But it's going to be really difficult to do right by your book if you don't do right by how you tell the story.
For me, I have to believe in a thing before I market it. I used to think I am not good at marketing. And once I got a job and I was paid a lot to do nothing but talk about company's product that I think does not even exist. And I found it really hard to even put sentences together. Like I was struggling. And when I promote my friends' books or art or my own stories, because I believe in them, I do really well. I get passionate, even if it's like now it's 6 p.m. and we're talking to you. And I'm like, I could do it even at like 3 a.m. anytime, because I'm talking to my friends that I believe they're actually doing real stuff. And I believe that there is something that is worth getting. And they'll do everything to make sure that people will get that. But if I don't believe in it, no matter how much you pay me, no matter how much you beg me, no matter how much you force me, nothing will work.
Absolutely. I mean, that rings true for me in my experience, certainly.
And do you have anything else you would like to talk about before we ask you to read?
Maybe just before I read, I can offer a little bit of introduction about this book. It's a poetry collection that is structured as a Greek tragedy, and it traces the psychological and familial fallout of job loss in our present world. It looks at the cost of automation, artificial intelligence, economic displacement, and what that does to people who have work not only as their livelihood, but also as their identity. And so the book moves through workplace communication, domestic scenes. It follows this speaker who's navigating a professional erasure while bearing witness to what it's doing to his marriage, him as a parent, and to a sense of belonging as he struggles to figure out what it is that as he says, that he's going to become next. So this one is titled Work. And it comes from the collection Reduction in Force, and it appears early in the book as the speaker has just kind of found out this has happened to him and is kind of trying to make sense of this. Work. Work is meaning, and I know this is wrong. Work is meaning, and I'm compensated for it. Work is meaning to get to that spreadsheet when I'm back at my desk on Monday. It's meaning to finish an email, or it's meaning to finally get that project off the ground. It's the way I think about what I contribute to the world. It's the label that appears next to my name, how I might be introduced at a party, or to new company, or to a new company, or when someone new joins the team at work. Work is meaning in the face of rising seas and heat and coups and disappearings. It's the new assimilation, reason to forget my mother tongue, my mother's tongue. It's the implicit why for the latest business book I'm reading, or that new podcast on auto download. It's how my children see me contributing to the world as they learn about its apathy and unfairness and lack of regard. It's what they think about when someone asks them what they want to be when they grow up.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me pull up one here. This one is titled Rest Day. I found a spot in the room we never use. Good lighting, a chair seldom claimed. For all the time it's been here, I didn't know it could fit so right. There's a recent novel I've been meaning to start. After a while, the pages don't hold me, so I am napping before I realize. It's fine. I am no longer the kind who needs to finish a book. In the afternoon, I pull out the cutting board and chop vegetables for a base. I still love meals that stop everything. I planned this day to break the new routine. I would not open the laptop. I would not answer email. Though the idea of doing nothing was more appealing than its practice. All day long, as I watch from inside, shadows traverse the yard in a direction opposite the sun. And what other thing can do that? Move the world opposite itself.
Thank you. I love it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We appreciate you, and thank you for making the time.
Yeah, this was great.
Absolutely. Thanks again.
Have a great night.